So I will call this regularly scheduled meeting of the board to order. The first item on our agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. If we could all rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The next item on our agenda is the adoption of the agenda. I'll seek a motion to adopt the agenda.
So moved. Goodburn.
Thank you, Ms. Goodburn. Is there a second?
Second, Guy.
Thank you, Reverend Guy. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
The next item on our agenda is public comment. Regularly scheduled public comment is from 5:30 to 6 prior to our meeting's business. Tonight we have one speaker, Ms. Lisa Feingold.
Bless you. My name is Lisa Feingold. I am an employee of the district, and I have a student at Shawnee Mission North. In statistics, certainty is measured by confidence. Dr. Fulton in fall 2020 wrote, "Certainty is an important idea. Certainty provides predictability and comfort in our lives." Regarding the bond issue, it's certain there are specific guidelines as to what language can legally be included on the ballot. At the October 12th Board of Education meeting, the question was asked, how will the bond be worded so that the community knows that we are addressing teacher workload with the bond issue? Consultant Gina Rykoff provided the answer. Bond language on the ballot usually parrots language in the statute. However, it is very rarely just the language in the ballot that informs voters. In fact, it is usually an afterthought for your voters, she said, and it's the information the district releases to the community usually performs that function. Also on October 12th, the board discussed bond options and obligations to listed projects. District administration said once the district makes a decision, it's a commitment to the community. And if the bond passes, the commitment becomes a promise. Here are a few certainties. We are living in unusual times. Confidence is a factor in the decision-making process. Decisions made by the community will impact the course of action for the district, staff, and students. Decisions made by the board will determine the course of action for the district, staff, and students. Not everyone in this room will be here a year from now. Here is what is uncertain. Who will be accountable for delivering on the promises made? Decisions made in the immediate future will have a lasting effect on our community. There are often mentions of limitations as to what can be said. Please address the uncertainties and give immediate attention to what can. Thank you.
Thank you. There are no further public comments this evening, and so we will be recessed until 6 p.m. when we will resume. Thank you. Okay, it's 6 o'clock. We are returning, and the next item on our agenda is the superintendent report from Dr. Fulton.
Okay, thank you very much. Great to see everybody this evening. Well, I want to start off with some very exciting news. Last week we had an opportunity to honor one of our newest teachers, Susan Speck, who's a health and physical education teacher from Shawnee Mission Northwest. She is Shawnee Mission's newest Horizon Award honoree. Kansas Commissioner of Education Randy Watson surprised her with an announcement of that honor last week. And the Horizon Award recognizes teachers who demonstrated outstanding work in their first year as an educator in Kansas. She's one of only 32 Kansas educators to receive this honor this school year. And as a district, we're very proud of Susan and know she represents the many phenomenal educators that we have throughout our district. So again, congratulations to her. We want to share a reminder for our families and staff that meal pickups are taking place from 6:45 to 7:30 a.m. on Fridays at all schools. Food service continues to provide breakfast and lunch to all students, regardless of their learning model. As the new year has begun, Food Service has also encouraged families that have not already applied for free and reduced meals to apply if they believe that they might qualify. There is a possibility that additional pandemic electronic benefit transfer funds may be available later this school year for those who have been approved for free or reduced meals. A link for more information for families will be included in the board recap, and so we just encourage all of our families who qualify to take advantage of this opportunity. The East Central Kansas Music Educators Association is recognizing 2 Shawnee Mission teachers for their excellence in the classroom. Penny Sneed, who's a Shawnee Mission Northwest Band Director, has been selected as the East Central Kansas Music Educators Association High School Band Director of the Year for 2021. Jonathan Wiebe, who's a Shawnee Mission South Orchestra teacher, has been selected as the ECKMEA, that's the acronym for the association, High School Orchestra Director of the Year. We want to congratulate both of these wonderful teachers for their accomplishments and the recognitions that they've received from their professional organization. ECKMEA describes the award winners as standing tall among the ranks of the finest of Kansas music educators. So again, congratulations to them. Well, I'll give you a quick bond update. Ballots have been mailed to Shawnee Mission School District residents so they can decide on the $264 million bond issue. As you know, this bond proposes facility updates to all of our buildings across the district, including the rebuilding of 5 elementary schools. It's also would provide a way for us to hire additional secondary teachers. This move would help secondary teachers move from teaching 6 out of 7 hours periods a day to 5 out of 7 in order to better support the student learning experience. We encourage everyone to vote, and we're including an example in the board recap of what the ballot looks like. I also want to encourage, you can see that on the screen, by the way. I also want to encourage anyone in our community who might be hearing questions about the bond to direct them to our website. You know, some of the questions that we've heard are things like, how was the proposal developed? How is the district proposing to spend the money? How will the bond help Shawnee Mission teachers and students? So we have all that information on our website. And again, we'll include a link to it in the bond recap. One nice thing about having everything on our website is that this becomes a public commitment to the bond issue projects that we've identified. And as you go through a bond issue, you just naturally will update our community on the progress that we're making on those various identified areas for improvement in our facilities. So that concludes my my report for tonight.
Thank you. The next item on our agenda is the organization of our own board. I did receive nominations for the presidency, the vice presidency, and for the SMAC position. I was nominated for president, and Mary Sinclair was nominated for vice president, and Jamie Borgman was nominated to continue in her role as our SMAC liaison. It is possible for me to take any additional nominations, should there be additional nominations from the board this evening. So I'll give anybody a moment. In light of that, and in light of no one running in opposition, those positions will be filled by acclamation. So congratulations to Dr. Sinclair and to Ms. Borgman, and I appreciate to have the opportunity to continue to serve in this capacity. So that was, do we have to vote? Okay, well then let's vote. I'll seek a motion for those 3.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Stratton. Is there a second?
Second, Goodburn.
Thank you, Ms. Goodburn. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Okay, hearing none, that passes unanimously. And I guess we can move on. That was pretty efficient. We have our board workshop for this evening, and the first item on our agenda for the board workshop is the COVID update.
Okay, and I believe Mr. Smith's going to operate this for me. I'm going to give you a very kind of brief factual update on where we are in the district with COVID-19. I know there's been some developments, particularly announcement of the vaccine coming. I'm sure people have interest in that. I will share with you what we know, and it's actually pretty limited. So here's what we do know. First of all, we have every school in our district is currently offering free COVID-19 testing for students, staff, and household members if you're symptomatic, along with any asymptomatic individuals with a known exposure. This has been a huge help because this really helps us to get a better handle on exactly what's happening in our schools. And so we just want to continue to encourage staff, students, and their family members to take advantage of this opportunity. It helps us to keep school open. Also, we are doing weekly surveillance testing of all of our special education staff, and that's designed, again, to keep a really good handle on where COVID-19 is in our district and also provide a layer of protection for them, since some of our special education staff work with students who are not able to mask, and we know that that raises the risk factor. On the vaccine, here's what we know. We're working with Johnson County Department of Health and Environment to do a couple things. One is we want to identify a plan for how to roll vaccines out once they become available. That's going to be a big task because not only is it going to be for all of these staff members in Shawnee Mission, but they have all the educators across the entire county to deal with. That's a lot of people, so well over 3,500 just for us alone. So we're going to have a plan on how we're going to do that. We do know that at the moment, we only have vaccines available for adults, so 16 or over. We have had some movement forward with some of our staff. Anyone on our staff who's considered a healthcare professional in Kansas either has received a vaccine or will be given is in the process of being given the first dose of vaccine. So, for example, that would include nurses, physical therapists, occupational therapists, and so on. So, the only people getting vaccines right now are those who are categorized in Kansas as health professionals. That is the first wave of people getting vaccines. Educators as a whole will appear in that second group, and I'll go through that in a second. So, it's encouraging. Vaccines are available, but it's only for adults ages 16 and over. We're going to have to continue using our mitigating procedures for a foreseeable amount of time. And what we have as challenges ahead is we don't know when the vaccines are going to come. When we do get it, it's going to be pretty short notice based on everything that we've experienced so far. And there's a lot of logistics on getting the vaccine to our staff. So we'll keep you updated on how we're progressing in those areas. Kansas does have on their website actually some helpful information on how they're rolling these vaccines out. And everybody's in one of 5 categories. They're working through that first phase right now. That's all the healthcare professionals, residents of long-term care facilities, and anybody else who's critical to the pandemic response in the community. Second phase, now you start to get into people 65 or older, those who are dealing with where you've got a lot of people in their settings, and high contact critical workers. So we can arguably fall in those second 2 bullets. We don't know exactly when that's going to be available. We're hopeful soon, but just got to be patient. Hopefully we'll, if not by the end of this month, by February, hopefully we'll start to see that happen. But again, we don't have a date yet. And then you can see the 3rd, 4th, and 5th phases here. It's important to note that you don't get to students, again, age 16 and over, until phase 5. So we'll just see when we're able to get those vaccines to our staff and then eventually to our students. But you can see why that comment is we're going to be dealing with mitigating strategies for quite a long time. Certainly until we can get a vaccine for younger children included in that. All right, so we updated our dashboard today, and so you can get a little bit of idea of where we are with our exposures. So this will give you an idea of the exposure of staff. We had about 72 staff in isolation. 28 of those were from the community, 19 were unknown. And so kind of gives you an idea of where we are with that. And then also for our students, in terms of active isolation cases, that gives you an idea of the numbers. And then if you go on the next slide, it kind of gives you a historical view of where we're at. So you have to be a little bit careful with this data because we didn't collect data over the winter break. So we've got a little bit of missing data there. But we'll continue to track this really carefully. This will help inform our decision about what to do with students going forward. On that note, one of the things that we are going to do is, as you know, second semester, which is around January 25th, 26th, that time period, our secondary students will go back into school in a hybrid mode. Now, I know there's a lot of interest in getting secondary students back in whole. I've received a number of emails to that effect. But the reality is this, the vaccine becomes critical here, and we're going to have to just carefully monitor what is and is not possible yet this school year. But hopefully we get back into hybrid mode, stay in hybrid mode for the foreseeable future. That's step number one. We also know that this pandemic is having an impact on, certainly on all of us with our physical, emotional state. It's been tough, right? But we also understand that it's having an impact on learning with students nationally, globally. And so we want to be mindful of that. Tonight we have a little report for you that gives you a little bit of an idea on where some of the early indicators that we're seeing of how COVID might be impacting our students in their learning. We're going to continue to monitor indicators as we go throughout this school year with the idea that we're going to have to develop a plan to really make sure and effectively address student learning needs, not just this year, but for the next couple of years. And as one indicator that I think people are very aware, this is not going to be an overnight fix. You saw in the most recent legislation that was passed, COVID relief legislation that was passed at the national level, that they are going to provide additional funding to schools to help with things like COVID-related expenses, and you can use it to target things like student learning to get maybe some interventions in place that kids need. And that will run through September of 2023. So I think everybody's very realistic about this nationally. We have to understand what students have been impacted, what's the nature of that impact, and then begin to design a plan that helps them be successful in their learning. And this learning ladder you're looking at really describes that. So here's our challenge, not just in Shawnee Mission, but nationally and even globally, is it's always been the case that students kind of walked in where they walked in, right? If you're a certain age, you go into a certain grade level, and there's content that you learn. It's always been the case that for some children that model worked really well, and for others, not so much. Maybe they could go faster, maybe they needed more time. So this is a reminder to us that as we think about planning forward, that we've got to keep an open mind about what our school designs will look like to make sure that we're meeting kids where they are, not where we think they ought to be, and help them to be both high school ready, so they're ready for high school course content, and that they're college and career ready. So there'll be more on that later on, but that's just kind of a big picture update. With that, I'm going to turn over right into our next presentation, and that is under Dr. Hubbard's department. And I believe Dr. Grumman's going to kick it off, and then Dr. Hubbard will have some comments at the very end of the presentation. So Dr. Grumman's here, and he'll be doing the bulk of the presentation along with Dr. Dennis, and there'll be some others that might jump in and help if needed.
Good morning. Or good evening, actually. Thank you. It's been that kind of day.
It's all right, it's all right.
So the results we're going to share with you tonight speak to the learning and systems strategies within the strategic plan. So there is a strategic plan reference as we are evaluating this type of information. Our focus tonight is on the effects of the pandemic on learning over the last 12 to 18 months. And with me to help share some of this information is Dr. Dennis, and then we have some of our curriculum and instruction folks here behind us to help answer some questions as we move forward. We are fortunate to have a partner with NWEA since 2005. NWEA MAP assessments are uniquely designed to measure student growth over long periods of time. The data has helped to inform our understanding of student learning through many transitions over the last 15 years. Those transitions have included changes in state assessment, shifts in federal and state policies, and of course learning through the pandemic. So this data has really helped us to bridge a lot of other gaps when other data system things have changed. So we've really received some benefit from having this data available and being a long-term partner with NWEA. Now, the sample graph exemplifies what I mean by our ability to examine student growth over time. With this data, we have the capacity to look back at a student's progress and compare it with their projected or expected trajectory. So, for example, in this graph, you can see, and this is just a sample student. This isn't anything particular yet. But, for example, in this graph, you can see a student's score history since the spring of 2018, as well as their expected growth looking forward to the winter and spring windows in 2021. So every student has a growth trajectory. If they take an assessment in the fall, they get like a winter and a spring, and even a predictor for the following fall, so then they can evaluate their progress in relationship to an expected growth value. And so that's the part we're going to be looking at tonight. So we're not looking at whether students are on, above, or below grade level. We're looking at how students are meeting their expected growth rates, again, which is based on the initial score and grade level. You may have noticed that there is a national conversation going on around student learning recently. Much of it might be slightly overshadowed by other events, but you won't have to peel back many layers to find some of these articles. You'll find that NWEA's findings are a major component in this conversation. So the screenshots that I have up here just show, for example, there's an NPR podcast that was posted on December 1. There's also an article that's published in a special edition of Education Week in some of those specialty areas. But there's a number of other articles out there that talk about learning throughout the pandemic and how schools are addressing that. I'm going to start off with a brief overview of what NWEA staff are seeing on a national scale, and then we'll proceed into some data that we're seeing on a district level. So looking at the NWEA study in the area of reading, this graph illustrates reading growth over two different time frames. You have the graph to the left of the blue bar, and then you have the graph to the right. The green bars, the ones at the top, represent students who exceeded their growth expectations. The blue bar represents students who essentially met their growth expectations. They're sort of on track. They may have been slightly above or slightly below their trajectories, but they're on track within a statistical margin. And the red bars represent students whose growth was well below their expected trajectories. The bars left of the blue line show reading growth from roughly January of 2019 to October of 2019. In other words, the bars on the left show what growth looked like in a presumably normal year. That's the non-pandemic related graph. The bars on the right show reading growth, again on a national scale, from January 2020 to October 2020, which spans the pandemic year and stay-at-home orders and some remote learning, and of course the summer break as well. The growth projections do take summer breaks into consideration, so that's already figured into those numbers. As you might notice in reading, there really does not appear to be much difference between the left-hand graphs and the right-hand graphs. So using the NWEA national data set, it does not appear that the pandemic, it has had a substantial effect on MAP growth. There's some other, considerations within the study, but just from a bird's eye view, not a significant effect here. If we look at a similar type or similar comparison with math, the story is a little different. This graph illustrates math growth over 2 different time frames. Again, the bars on the left represent growth from roughly January 2019 to October 2019. Bars on the right, growth from January of 2020 to October of 2020, which the bars on the right span the pandemic. It's a little hard to read, but each of the bars are grade levels. So you see grades 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then the right-hand bars are grades 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So if you're not able to see those, their numbers are kind of tiny. So as you can see, there are some stark differences appearing in the mathematics growth graphs that we did not see in the reading graphs. The differences between the 2 growth snapshots appear to be greater at the elementary grade levels, at grades 4, 5, and 6. The effects are still significant at grades 7 and 8, but numerically the differences are maybe not quite as pronounced as what you see in those elementary grade levels. This also highlights, if you remember on that earlier slide, why in that Education Week article that I highlighted, that article was titled Math Now, Problem Solving in a Pandemic. They have recognized nationally that there's something interesting going on with students, let's say, retention of math skills over that period of time. So on a local level, I attempted to apply a similar level of analysis that NWEA provided so that we have some consistency as we're talking about some of our data. So as I looked at Shawnee Mission data, when we receive information, we get whether or not students meet their growth target. There's categories of yes, a yes star, a no, or a no star. And the way I've defined it, I translated that into the gainers, maintainers, and sliders. It's the same terms that NWEA used in their study, so we kind of look at things from a similar perspective. So, and then the other piece that's slightly different in our data set is I'm looking at a fall to fall comparison. They use a winter to fall, but so this is a 12-month span instead of a 9-month time span. So this graph shows the percentages of gainers, maintainers, and sliders from the last 3 years. Some important notes to keep in mind from this last fall, or any fall testing. Normally, fall testing begins in August and ends in mid-September. You try to do the screening assessments right away at the start of the school year. This year, fall testing, of course, since we began school after Labor Day, fall testing began in September and then finished in mid to late October. Many of our students completed the NWEA MAP test from home. It can be proctored remotely. In fact, it's often proctored while students are live on the WebEx. The video turns off, but the teacher can still manage the audio piece, and the students can share their screen. So there's still some remote monitoring. During the test window, elementary schools were transitioning from remote to hybrid learning around that same time. So we did have actually quite a few students who did test in person. So there's a mixture of in-person and remote students testing in that fall data set. And remote testing does come with some challenges, including ensuring that students are not receiving some kind of help in the background. But like I said, teachers can still listen through the WebEx. They can also check student score histories to see whether they saw dramatic gains or drops. And the same applies when we're testing in person. Sometimes they have to look for those to see if there might be some invalid scores that require some retesting. The key thing to note here in this data set is that there are no substantial differences across these 3 graphs, and it might even look, in fact, it might even look like reading growth improved during the pandemic. There's some noise in the data perhaps, but it's interesting to see how that how this data is remarkably consistent over those 3 time spans. So the first 2 time spans would be presumably normal years. The graph, the bar on the right is the what I would label as the pandemic year. If I separate the same data out by grade level, and the grade level graphs are only showing the last 2 years, but you can observe some similarities or differences across grade levels as you're comparing the left-hand graph to the right-hand graph. You might be able to make some minor observations, but overall, the pandemic did not appear to have substantial effect on NWEA MAP performance in reading. And again, this pattern is quite similar to what we saw in the national data set that we looked at earlier. And even with my, the way I define, even when my differences of sliders, maintainers, and gainers, I define them slightly differently, the percentages are actually quite similar to NWEA's set as well. If we switch over to math growth in the span of those 3 years, you see in our what would look like as normal years, you usually have about 50% of the students that are what are maintainers, 23 or 24% of the students would normally be gainers, and 26 or 20%, 7% are sliders over those time periods. And as you can see on the right-hand graph with the pandemic, we jumped up to 38% students in that slider group, 44% maintainers, and 18% on gainers. And again, the pattern is similar to what was appearing in the national data set. Here's the math growth comparison by grade level. The other thing to keep in mind is, and when we're thinking about grade level here, the grade level indicates the terminal side of the test. So for example, where you see grade 9, that's really fall 8 to the start of grade 9. So when we're thinking about what grade level does that actually represent, the grade 9 is really all of grade 8 and they're entering grade 9. The grade 8 graph is all of grade 7 and they're entering grade 8. So if you're trying to imagine where those students are at that time, that's how those things are labeled on our graphs. Yes?
So to help me understand that chart, so if I look on the left side, the 7th graders had the 19% in the sliders category. Is it to presume that those 7th graders became the 8th graders on the next chart, which had the 44% deficiencies? That's that same group of students?
That would be, yeah, you could presume, it'd be a similar cohort, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, with some move in and moves out, but absolutely. Yeah. On this next chart, bear with me as I tell a story and walk through the table, because it's not normal that I would share logistic regression comparative met not met expected growth on NWEA map reading assessments. It's not, but the thing I want to illustrate here is that there are a lot of complexities when you start to think about the student group interactions that occur. So there's a couple questions that we're looking at here. One is did the pandemic have a statistically significant effect on learning gains? And the second one is, did the pandemic have some kind of disproportionate effect on learning gains for identified student groups? So, for example, we just saw the bar graphs just give it that bird's eye view, but a question that we could be asking is did, even though there was no significant impact on the larger population, did it somehow have a substantial impact on students receiving free and reduced lunch, or African American students, or some other identified group of students? So in the way we want to read this, first of all, we're going to work our way from left to right, and as you look at each of those 3 models, what I did is I ran the analysis 3 different times. Okay, and what I did is I took all 3 years of data and combined it into one giant data set. So there's 41,400 records in this data set. Okay? And then another thing to keep a note of as we're kind of looking at the numbers is the stars mean that the number is significant. Okay? 3 stars, very significant. 2 stars, kind of significant. 1 star, somewhat significant, right? And then a positive number means you increased your likelihood that you would meet your growth expectation, and a negative number means it decreased your likelihood that you'd meet the growth target. And then even when significant, the values are quite small, so the proportional increase or decrease is not, I wouldn't say, as extreme. So for example, in most of these increases or decreases, you're increasing or decreasing the student's chances by generally 10 or 15%. Likelihood. So you're looking at, for example, as I'm looking at Model 1, which I'm controlling for free and reduced lunch, students with disabilities, gifted, ELL, And then the constant is sort of that black box that represents anything else that I'm not controlling for, okay? And so with this, the 3 years combined, Model 1, students who are receiving free and reduced lunch, their likelihood for meeting their growth expectations is statistically is smaller than students who are not receiving free and reduced lunch, okay? Students who have a disability, according to the data set, their chances of meeting their growth target is a little lower than students without disabilities. Gifted has a stronger chance. ELL status, there's no significant predictor here. Okay, in Model 1, we're not looking at pandemic at all. We're just looking at the entire data set and some of these predictors. Part of the reason I'm running this without the pandemic is then we want to look at, moving left to right, what happens when we put the pandemic into the model. Okay? So, Model 2, I had added, we've got the free and reduced students with disabilities, gifted ELL as measures, and then we also work in the race ethnicity measures. Again, ignoring the pandemic for now, to see what are the effects moving left to right. You'll notice, for example, the constant part of it no longer becomes significant, which tells me that we've got a sufficient number of control variables in here, right? There's not some other mysterious variable that seems to be moving the data. But it also indicates that, we still have some gaps that we need to contend with, right? We still have some gaps between our race ethnicities, and those gaps are not completely explained by the overlap between free and reduced students with disabilities and gifted. Moving to Model 3. Model 3 is where I insert the COVID term, and notice in reading there are no stars on that number, that 0.02, and that confirms what we'd seen earlier. The COVID term had no substantial effect on student growth in reading, as we saw in the bar graphs. The other observation I'm making in here, because we had that race, ethnicity, and those subgroup questions, as I'm looking between Model 2 and Model 3, my screen is still up, sorry.
The presentation is in Board Docs. If anybody
Okay,
wants to-
I'll keep going with this. So as I'm comparing Model 2 and Model 3, those numbers didn't change when I introduced the pandemic data. That tells me that at least looking at this data, that there's not an outspoken or substantial effect on a specific subgroup in here. They seem to all be sort of equally affected or equally not affected in here. So that's where the conclusions to our second statement would be, is that the evidence would not show that there's, that there was, that the pandemic was particularly harsh on one particular group in reading. If I flip over to math, and we read the data kind of the same way. We're looking at the probabilities of whether or not students met their growth target in mathematics. You can see again in Model 1, free and reduced lunch made it a little tough for students to meet their growth target. Gifted gave students an advantage. ELL, students had an advantage. Moving to Model 2, those advantages and disadvantages for free and reduced, gifted, and ELL are still there. But then you also see in Model 2, there's a disadvantage for Hispanic and Latino students, an advantage for Asian students. And given that, even though I wouldn't want to say for white and black students there's no advantage or disadvantage, but as you're looking at race, ethnicity in general, it confirms that there are some gaps that still exist. The most prominent thing, though, is when we move to this Model 3 on the left. If you look at the number on the COVID term, at 0.52, that is the largest number out of any of those two graphs. That had a significant effect on student math gains, significant negative effect on student math gains over that time period. So that's a huge effect at here. The other thing, again, as I'm comparing Model 2 to Model 3, those coefficient numbers, like free and reduced, went from 0.08 to 0.10. There's maybe some movement, but it wouldn't characterize that as being massive. So as I'm looking at those coefficients going to left to right, there might be some effects as you introduce the pandemic, but again, I don't think it would suggest that there's any disproportionate effect on a particular subgroup. They seem to all be sort of equally disadvantaged, I suppose, due to the pandemic and mathematics. So some additional research questions and monitoring, and then I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Dennis to talk about some of the instruction and professional development that we're working on. But some questions are, what are the effects shown in mathematics short term? We are just now starting with the winter test window, so our map testing's beginning this week for the next 4 weeks or so. So I'll be very curious if I run the same analysis, say winter to winter from the last 3 years or fall to winter from the last 3 years, if we've seen some recovery since now we've had, a full semester of structured instruction in whether it's remote or hybrid or in person for a semester. So I'm hopeful that we'll see some bounce back in that data set. And then I'm also interested in seeing what the winter results look like. Are we able to sustain or see some increased growth in reading at the same time? So I'll definitely be looking at both of those factors after we get the winter data collected. Again, we're very fortunate to be able to have these data sets that we can kind of look back upon, because a lot of times you get, after a major event, people will ask, well, wouldn't it be great if we could study the effect of X on this, but we don't have the data from before it happened, and this is one of those times when we actually have that comparable data. So,
thank you, Dan. I just want to close our portion of the presentation with some thoughts about instruction, in particular in professional learning. I think that the data that that Dan has shared with you really demonstrates the importance of teachers and teaching, the impact that teachers have on a daily basis working with students, and that feedback they provide makes a difference, and that shows in the data. This also, just as a reminder again, the data was collected in September, maybe into early October, so most of the effect that we're talking about in terms of the pandemic would have happened during that spring semester when we were not in close contact with kids when they were at home, and then through the summer. So we will have another update, as Dan mentioned, in about a month, so we can judge how well we've been able to mitigate some of these losses. We have, however, fortunately built some structures over the last several years that we hope will make an impact, and we believe will make an impact. Some of them are listed on the screen. For example, response to intervention, we've put a lot of work into building structures to help provide systems of support for students academically. We've also put a lot of time and effort into professional learning communities, building a culture of collaboration and teacher teams to help work together to help support student learning. On the curriculum side, we have built priority standards across the board that really provide a focus for what's important, and we have been told on many occasions from teachers how helpful those have been. In terms of professional learning, the coaching model that we're using and that job-embedded professional learning that happens makes a big difference and impacts the ability of teachers to work with kids to support their learning. In addition, in the spring, we put together, the process was a little bit different, elementary versus secondary, but we facilitated a process to help identify the standards that students would have been missing from that fourth quarter when they weren't here. And so by having that identified and identifying where those standards could be integrated, we're hopeful that in the next round we'll be able to see some gains in that area as well. With that, we're going to conclude our portion of the presentation and open for questions. We have with us tonight some members of the CNI team, specifically Aaron Smith, Kristen Zook, and Krista Carson. So if you'd like to come up to the podium, ladies, we'll be glad to answer any questions.
Okay. I may just go around the table, or I can look to see. I'll start with Dr. Sinclair since I can't see her. Dr. Sinclair, do you have some questions to start us off this evening?
More of a comment. I just want to say thank you for running the regression analysis and helping us better understand how all those factors might interact. And just to reiterate, kind of the takeaway I see is that we're holding steady on reading, but much like we're seeing nationally, we're seeing less growth than expected in mathematics. Is that a fair assessment?
There are heads nodding. I know you can't see that, but there are heads nodding.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It is really helpful to see if we're getting differential impacts. It's an important piece we as a community, as a district, have committed to. So thank you again.
Thank you. Mr. Stratton, do you have any follow-up questions?
I was just wondering, is there a narrative piece that eventually goes with this data? Meaning, is there a solicitation of teacher input as they've gone through this big change and as they look at this data? And I don't know if these students are old enough, but if there's student input as well that helps better or further explain what the data is showing us.
I'm going to say we haven't gotten there yet, but I think those are ideas that we have talked about over time. Now, granted, schools, teachers know about these results. They've and then, in fact, have already, as soon as the fall results came in, we've been having conversations about shoring up math, doing some recovery, adding in some interventions, and so on. But as far as like systematically collecting the qualitative data pieces of that, I would say we have not yet done that.
Mr. Stratton, I would add that similar to our reopening plans where we engaged administrators, teachers, interventionists in those opening plans, we will be doing the same as we've just found out this past week about CARES funding that we will receive for the next 3 years. So we will need those teams to build that systemic plan. Buildings do a great job at that individually, and it's not going to look the same in every building, right, depending on the learners in those particular buildings. But we will have a systemic plan to use those funds for interventions, depending on what that looks like. And it may not look the same at each building, as I mentioned, but the plan itself will be systemic.
Thank you. I just want to make sure that my question was received as both what went right and what went wrong. So, it's such a sea change that we've been through that if I'm part of that data set and I was part of the delivering of the education, I'd be wanting to say, well, let me give you a little more behind the scenes on what my experience was here or here or here, because it's got to be such a unique situation. So thank you. Thank you. I'll look forward to that.
And I think some of the research bears out, when you learn to read, you don't really lose the reading skills necessarily, but math and some of the other technical skills, for example, we don't have science data here, but there is some indication, if it's one of those where if you're not practicing those skills on a regular basis, then those kind of things you're more likely to lose. Thinking about the math you learned in high school versus the reading that you learned in high school, I suspect that you might say that the reading has probably followed you pretty well, but have all the math skills stayed with you over that same course of time. So I think that's some of what we're running into as well over is thinking about how students learn that material.
For clarification, before we move to Reverend Guy, these MAP tests were taken very soon after children returned to school because we had the delayed start in the school year. I actually think it was one of the very first things my students did. So they left on March 13th, and then we did provide, online learning instruction, certainly not to the level that is available now during this semester. But so really, the first time they saw our kids after that significant chunk of time is when they took these tests. So I am very curious to see the data from the winter subset after having a more rigorous fall programming than what was provided those last few weeks in the summer. So I think that will be, when you're thinking of the narrative, what's the narrative? I know for my kids, the narrative was the first thing we have to do is take a map test. And I was like, yeah. But that, just thinking of where they were at over the summer, they were not engaged in that way. And then a lot of kids, we didn't offer the SMSD enrichment program this summer. That was not available. So a lot of things that we normally have in place just weren't there. So I know the concern is national, but when I think of the narrative, I'm like, man, that was really a stacked deck for some of our kids. Reverend Guy.
Thank you for this information. I think it's really helpful. And honestly, when I saw that we were going to see these results, I was kind of bracing for impact. But I'm just amazed at how hard I know our teachers and administrators have been working to keep these numbers from not being much worse than they are. So I'm very appreciative for everyone who's worked so hard. I just had a question. I've seen some news stories about a percentage of students nationwide who seem to be flourishing online because that somehow is tapping into their learning style in a way that in person didn't. And I don't know if we've had an opportunity to tease out any of that data to see if there are some students who, for whatever reason, are just learning better in reading and math and whatever other subjects, because the online format just seems to work better for how their brain is wired or whatever. And if that's just a small percentage, then maybe that doesn't matter and it doesn't affect the data, but I didn't know if there had been any attempts to try to identify those students.
Yes and no. I would say we are able to tease out, which students have been remote exclusively. One of the challenges in that question is even with our in-person students is they've been, throughout the year they haven't been solely in person. But yeah, those are excellent questions as we look at, teasing out the data, interviewing students, asking teachers how that works. What are the characteristics of these students that are, successful in a remote environment? Keeping in mind that even our remote instruction is still synchronous. They get a live teacher. They're on a schedule, which we want to make sure that is not also then mixed in with some of the asynchronous remote learning at the same time. So we want to make sure that when we look at those models, we're very clear as to what their learning model really is in that remote setting. But yeah, there certainly would be some students that are would be quite thriving in that environment, and they might be feeling less distracted compared to an in-person environment. So I would contend it's all part of this conversation about personalized learning and what's the best environment for all students.
We're also tracking some additional data in regards to remote versus in-person on attendance and grades, and so we'll be looking at that as we have more. We really wanted the first semester to come to a close so we could track it by semester. So we're looking at that now.
I'm just going to echo my fellow board members and saying thank you. This is a great, thorough analysis of the data and comparing it nationally to what's happening here in our district. So thanks for doing all that, and especially with a lens of DE&I. So I appreciate taking a closer look at that as well. So I appreciate, Dr. Dennis, when you had mentioned that, now what? What do we do now? And so you had mentioned there's a greater focus on math intervention and a response to intervention. Can you talk just briefly, what does that actually look like for students?
It looks like a systemic response, and it will vary not only by grade band, grade level, but also in various schools across the district. But each school has set up a system with triggers to determine where they can intervene most effectively and as early as possible to try to keep students from falling further behind. And when we've had a situation like this where we have a lot of kids who've come back after a long break and are behind, that's really, tested that system. But it's been the work of several years to get to the point where we are. We're not where we want to be yet, and we'll continue to work on that. But that's the basic structure looks like that.
So let's just take a hypothetical student. So we have a 7th grader who we've identified as, is, what's the not a gainer, a
Slider.
slider,
Right.
thank you. So what happens to that 7th grade student when they have been identified as a slider, for example?
At 7th grade, you're probably talking about a workshop class to provide that foundational support. At the elementary level, it would be more perhaps probably a pull out or even a push in to help support those basic skills. At the middle level, that's harder to do just because of the nature of the way middle schools are set up. And so it probably means a class that you would take to support those skills.
And so, but this is occurring now, this is happening?
It is.
Okay, thank you very much. And I also wanted to echo, thank you to the teachers who have, had many sleepless nights trying to make sure that all students are, continuing to progress. So, as my other board members have also mentioned, thank you.
Ms. Borgman, I would also add that also, and you all have approved this over the last couple of meetings, but our elementary title schools are using a program called IXL, which allows kids to, it's software that allows additional support. Greg Tang is a consultant that we hired at just the last board meeting in many of our title schools that is providing, he is providing professional learning to those schools. I know Shawnee is.
He's been with us in the last couple of summer institutes as well.
Perfect. So Shawnee is very engaged with him at teaching math differently and really engaging with at-risk learners. Aaron may be able to add additional information. Anything else you would add? But I know that if you follow anything on Twitter right now, I know Shawnee, Comanche, those are the two I can name off the top of my head right now that are very engaged in that professional learning and really trying to meet those learners where they are.
To answer your question a little further, our teachers are doing a really wonderful job of looking at this data that Dan has provided closely, and they're working to diagnose specifically the skills that the students are missing on an individual case-by-case basis. So as Dr. Dennis mentioned, once we diagnose from the data what skills in math that the student is missing, then we determine the right intervention match for that child. And so we're fortunate in Shawnee Mission that the board has approved a number of math intervention programs that are really designed to support students who may be missing some math skills. So as Dr. Hubbard mentioned, we did just approve the purchase of IXL, which is certainly supporting that learning. Working with Greg Tang the last few years has been really beneficial for our teachers, because as we go down the road of identifying priority standards, Greg Tang has also helped us determine what are the best math models and strategies for supporting those specific standards. And then we've had some math intervention programs in place historically that our elementary teachers and our middle school and high school teachers have been using over time with a lot of success. So I think our teachers have done a tremendous job of being able to really use this data to diagnose where those missing skills are and select the right math intervention program to meet those needs.
Thank you very much for that further clarification as well. Thank you all very much.
I just want to add one additional thing. While we have purchased a lot of intervention materials, those materials are just that. They're all materials that can be used for a variety of kids, but no intervention program is as strong as a teacher in front of them. So I just want to be clear that we're not saying that software is the answer, because it's not. A strong classroom teacher in front of kids is our best answer.
I'd just reiterate the thanks, especially for disaggregating according to all those variables. I think that's really, really helpful for us to be not just attuned to how COVID is playing out for our students as a whole, but really watching for those places it's having disproportionate impact. So I'm especially grateful for that. My question is just, I read some of the stuff on the national NWEA materials, and it sounded like there are some students who are just missing altogether from the educational system. So while some of our numbers may look better or worse, there are also just maybe fewer students taking the test than in previous years. So do we have any sense of how many students in Shawnee Mission took the MAP test this go around as opposed to the same time last year?
So we were able to test almost all of our students, let's say 95% participation rate. So it's very similar to what we've had in previous years. We've been very successful at being able to reach out to students to ensure that they've tested and screened. You know, if we find that a student is just for some reason unable to take a MAP assessment, then we've got other screener tools available. But I would say well over 90% of our students were able to participate. The study, in some ways, the study refers to in a number of urban areas. There's places that were just, you know, we've had the benefit of being able to provide remote instruction and provide connections through WebEx and Canvas, and so that really got us off to a great start in being able to, you know, connect with students remotely on day one. So we're generally really in a good place with that. But yeah, not every district has had that opportunity. Not every district was able to start the year with a Canvas or some sort of LMS and was we're ready to go with a WebEx and some of these other remote tools that we were able to leverage.
Ms. Goodburn. My question was asked and answered, so thanks for the data. I look forward to the winter data.
Does anyone have any final follow-up questions for this section? Ms. Embry?
I had just one, and I think Dr. Hubbard started to allude to it, but I feel like MAP gives us a really good handle on sort of 4th through 9th graders, and then our high school students are a big question mark. So what are the tools we have, and what are the tools we're planning to use to assess how we're really doing for our high school students? Because I at least hear more from parents of high school age kids who are saying, my kid has a C for the first time ever. You know, that's the emails we get. So.
It's certainly a little tougher when you get up to the sophomore, junior, senior level because you have students that are in a variety of courses. And there's not an assessment like a MAP assessment. You hit the ceiling on what it's capable of measuring when you reach, especially when you get past 9th grade. So an assessment like that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for that level. But as you alluded to, we are looking at some other things like attendance and grades and they're not, they don't have those growth components, but there are some, there are another way to measure student engagement and success to measure that we can compare with prior years.
I would add, we also have some common assessments that we'll be looking at with staff at the secondary level. I totally agree with Dan. I think especially after the 10th grade, it's very difficult to have a great, complete set of data for high school kids. Obviously, the ACT will continue to be watching progress on the ACT. And we'll still be looking at those indicators. You've seen Dr. Fulton talk oftentimes about the predictor of Algebra 2 on kids, so we'll still be tracking that for Algebra 1 and Algebra 2, and then some of those other core contents. And I think it's a similar question pre-K too. With our non-readers, we were having this discussion today, and I had it with Dr. Fulton the other day, but I'm really curious to see what that looks like. I mean, once I'm a reader, starting to be a really good reader, and I was home for a pandemic, and I'm guessing kids read probably more than they've read in a long time. I know mine did, because what else were they doing? Kids were home, and so maintaining some of that skill set where it makes me wonder what was happening with 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and what data set we have for that. So I think, it's a similar question at that age as well. So we'll be continuing to track that data as we go here.
So I just have one follow-up question. With regards to impact on these performance readings with MAP, do we know what the general impact of trauma is on students' performance on the MAP test? Do we have a general baseline of how a student undergoing trauma versus a student that's not undergoing trauma, how they perform?
Off the top of my head, I can't say that we do. We'd have to identify some, I would say, proxy measures for that, because a trauma measurement would be something that would be challenging to get a hold of on a large scale. So.
And while it's not specific to MAP, we do have a set of and Christy, you're going to have to help me here just a little bit, but the first set of data for Panorama for this year, and we just received it within the week, and we're starting to dig into that data. Any preliminary things you want to share, or I'm not even sure if we are that far along yet?
Maybe.
No, and what's challenging about the Panorama is if you think about where we were when we entered into the pandemic last spring, we hadn't fully had an opportunity to fully implement that tool. So we're basically starting at square one with our baseline.
So our baseline is during COVID?
But there are some promising pieces that are in the data. We just need to spend some time unpacking a little bit more before we report.
I know it's not necessarily the same parallel for children as it is for adults, but performance-wise, adults are certainly having difficulty functioning. I know Johnson County Mental Health has reported that for adults, mental health concerns are higher, and that impacts performance. And while children are more resilient, we do know that this has certainly had an emotional impact as well. So while a lot of it is perhaps the learning method, but I just know when a kiddo is undergoing something that's difficult, I would expect that would have an impact on their ability to perform. So I would like to know if that's something we can tease out. I don't know, but it's certainly in my thought process in reviewing this. So that's all I have. And if there aren't any further follow-ups, thank you very much for the presentation. It's appreciated having you here this evening. It was very informative. And I think we get to move on to the legislative platform.
We do. Thank you very much. And again, thanks to all the folks presenting this evening. You did a great job. I believe we have David Smith, who not only works as our Chief Communications Officer, but also is our district's legislative liaison. And then Dr. Stuart Little, who is also works on our behalf with the legislature. They're going to, I think, help you facilitate a conversation that you're going to have with respect to our legislative platform. So I'll turn it over to David.
Good evening, Board. I've got Dr. Little here with me. I'm going to ask him to begin with a general overview of the legislative session that is beginning today, and then I will follow up with some specifics about our draft platform. Dr. Little.
Thank you, Madam President.
Right here.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President, members of the board. I appreciate the opportunity to come and chat with you briefly. As David described, today is the beginning of the 2021 legislative session, and I'll hit a couple of highlights on some issues that will be then the context and when some of the issues that you all will discuss in your legislative platform would be dealt with. I think first and foremost, the legislative session, like the school year, usually starts with great optimism and hope, and I think between COVID and civil unrest issues, there's been a very different tone in Topeka today, and I think that will continue. I think the process is going to be incredibly different. There's going to be disruption to the regular ways that we've had hearings, that we conducted advocacy, that we reached out to legislators, that we've done in the past, had those kind of conversations. There are going to be access challenges. The ability to testify in committees is going to be different and much more structured, and it's going to be, let's put it this way, we're supposed to have video up to watch every committee that begins tomorrow, and as far as we can tell, none of those are operating yet. So it's going to be, that's part of what the state is invested in. It's going to happen at some point, but it's certainly not necessarily operational yet. It'll be a challenge for grassroots folks, for teachers, for parents, those folks to communicate with legislators because the building is not going to be wide open. You can't take a group of people in and sit down and have conversations. It's going to be small, targeted meeting, those that are choosing to take meetings with people. So there are going to be any number of challenges to try to do any level of communication. Lots of it's going to be electronic, obviously. The issue, the legislature is going to deal with a lot of big issues in terms of the governor's authority, the authority of health officers, tax policy, Emergency Management Act, telemedicine, lots of those kinds of issues are going to get wrestled with. I would suspect that in general, school funding, because of some of the revenue stability that has been existing more than folks had anticipated, the funding issues are going to be, I'm not saying they're going to be easy, but sustaining that funding is going to be, there's going to be a lot of other things going on. I think we're going to be likely to have some success and stability with that. I know that's important right now, given all of the issues that you all have to deal with and are dealing with ongoing, that the more we can get the funding taken care of and not have to address a variety of other issues are going to be helpful. There will be some issues, some challenges going on, I think, that are going to impact us and require us to get engaged on some topics. Holding off some things that the district may not be supportive of, non-public schools and some issues there and some other restraints or additional burdens that may be placed upon you all as you're trying to deal with a lot of issues. So that's what we'll probably spend a lot of time on. And I feel like the draft platform that you all have in front of you establishes a lot of those principles and positions so that we can use that to communicate with the members of the delegation going forward. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
So Dr. Little mentioned our draft platform. Those of you who were here last year, much of this will look familiar to you. One thing, obviously, that wasn't in play last year was COVID-19. So we have taken the category of health, safety, and social and emotional well-being. We've added COVID-19 to that and moved it up to the beginning of our platform. So the areas that we have are health, safety, and well-being with COVID-19, school finance, support for rigorous academic standards for all students, and support for public schools. Under health, we've added some bullet points specifically around COVID. The first would be to maintain your authority as a local board of education to make decisions around the health and well-being of students and staff. That you all obviously take that incredibly seriously. You work hard at it. You ask for the information that you need to make good decisions, and you are best placed to make those decisions, and we want to make sure that that continues. We know that districts are facing challenges associated with COVID-19, and we want to make sure that we can get additional support for that. But also, if we're going to be successful in ultimately moving beyond this pandemic, there needs to be support for statewide public health capacity. So that's going to be on the table as well. Districts are facing funding challenges associated with changes in enrollment, which in many cases may be temporary, but impact future years' funding. So we want to make sure that districts such as ours aren't negatively impacted by that. And then, of course, we want to make sure if we're going to get kids back in school, then educators have to have access to the vaccine and quickly. And we think we're pretty confident now that the state has said that educators are in that second group, but we want to make sure that that continues. If we're going on, we do want to make sure we have points on Medicaid expansion, mental health and behavioral health services, support and flexibility in terms of implementing the results of the bullying and dyslexia task forces, continued for us to be able to protect ourselves from and our children and staff from gun violence. Under school finance, again, these will all look familiar to you for the most part, particularly beginning with protecting the authority of the Kansas Constitution. That's in our platform every year. We have very clear language in the Kansas Constitution that it's critically important that that stay there, establishing the authority of the legislature for the suitable and equitable funding of public education. That's foundational to our state, and we want to make sure that it stays. One point that we did add is to make sure there's a concern that the numbers around at-risk funding, that we've suffered some declines in there based on enrollment, and we want to make sure that we can continue to do everything we need to for our at-risk students. And so we're going to be lobbying to make sure that we don't, and districts that serve large numbers of at-risk students like ours don't take a hit for that. Under rigorous academic standards for all students, and that's something that not everybody has in their platform, but under Dr. Fulton's leadership, this is all about student learning, and we want to make sure, even at the legislative level, that we are doing everything we can to ensure that legislation allows us to be successful. So things like support for early learning programs, for a state assessment system that provides timely and meaningful feedback to students, supports their growth and towards college and career readiness, and also meets the ESSA standards. But really, getting an assessment system that is of value to students is critically important. And then the last section, support for public schools. Dr. Little mentioned earlier the point about concerns about funds being moved into private schools. We want to make sure that Kansas continues to have a strong public school system and that our resources benefit all students. So you see the draft in front of you. We'll bring it to you next time for approval, and certainly if there are any thoughts or comments, we would entertain those at this point.
Does anyone have any questions with regards to the platform for this evening? We are not voting tonight, so you do have time to think on it. If there's something else that you would like to add or have a conversation about, you can forward that information to David so that when we get the final draft at our January meeting, we can vote on it. And then once we've voted and approved the final draft, Stuart will provide it and communicate it to our legislators. So if there aren't any, yeah, Brad, go ahead.
Now that the session's begun today, are we being provided with information about how the session's going to play out, and more specifically about the process of governance and policy making? Meaning, are there any curves that have been presented that we might want to address either in the platform or regarding process, or just plain for us to have a better understanding? Are there any shortcuts being taken, et cetera, to the process that we can tell at this point that we need to be aware of?
Well, organizationally and structurally, no, that we're going to have committee hearings. We're going to move bills through the regular process. The leadership has been careful about making sure that legislators who, despite the spacing that's taking place on the floor in the House, not in the Senate, but in the House, where legislators will be separated, that folks will be able to do committee meetings from their offices if they want. When they're voting, they can do it electronically, but you're going to have to be in the building. I think part of that issue is that because there is no mandate to wear a mask, and that was evident today in the State House, and so that's something that's compelling some folks will be doing a lot of their work out of the office. Structurally and procedurally, we will still have the hearing schedules taking place and moving forward. So I don't think there's going to be anything that is going to be a barrier in terms of how work will be done. I think it will be more challenging because it's literally just hard to get people into the building and to make time to talk with the legislators and those folks and do some of that contact work.
And I haven't looked, but is the calendar similar? Meaning, is turnaround already set, those kinds of things?
Yes, and the calendar's published on the front page of the website. There's a button there on the legislature's website, but we'll get to the beginning of the first week of March and do first turnaround, and then we get to the beginning of April, and that'll be the end of the regular session. I think it's the 4th or 5th. They'll be gone for 3 weeks and come back at the end, the very beginning of May, for the veto session. So the structure will look similar, yes.
Thank you.
Reverend Guy?
I just had a quick question on your very first bullet point. I just wondered when I saw it if somebody could use that, twist it in a way to say that we would not support the governor issuing a shelter-in-place statewide because we wanted to maintain authority over our own school district, which I know was some of the conversation when her shelter-in-place order was made. So I didn't know if we needed to add words or if it's obvious that we're not talking about that. I just didn't know. So I wanted to throw that out there for both of you, just to make sure that no one would use that against us if somehow the pandemic got worse and there was another.
Can I add in too? Because I actually had a question on that bullet point as well, Laura, because I've heard us sort of say in passing something along the lines of, it'd be great if all the districts in the county were doing something similar. It'd be great if the health department could do more than just offer recommendations, but actually have more teeth to their recommendations. I've heard things like that said. So I think a question to me is whether we really do think this is the right level of governance to be making those decisions, or whether we are more agnostic on that, because there's a lot to unpack in that one bullet point, to Laura's point.
And so maybe it's going to require more to say exactly what we mean. I mean, my thinking, as I said earlier, is around, I've, for the last 9 months, witnessed the care that you all have taken with regard to these issues and how intentional you've been about the decisions that you've made. And so my thinking, I think, was want to make sure that you continue to have the ability to do that. But Reverend Guy, as you mentioned, and you're right, we don't want that to be confused with being able to prevent the governor from making broad statements about public health that she needs to be able to make. So let me think about how we.
Realistically, will she be able to make those decisions? Are they not planning on stripping her authority to do so? I think it may be moot.
They may already have taken her
I think
authority.
they're planning on stripping her authority to have the ability to do that in any event. So,
well, I understand, but I think it's still an important theoretical point to make that it does apply to counties.
I did just notice that it said in that paragraph, the health, safety, and social and emotional well-being, it says the crisis has highlighted the diverse character of our states.
Yes, got it.
And if you guys have recommended language for that bullet point, if you can just forward it to David so that he can work through that and work it in, that'd be great. Does anybody have any further questions or concerns? Okay.
I have one. Sorry,
Yeah,
this is just
go ahead.
a new board member question still. It hasn't been a year yet, so I still have like 4 more days to say.
You're fine.
New board member. David, I'm curious, do we have like a federal policy agenda of any kind? Because I'm thinking of all those federal feeding programs that we're taking advantage of so much in Shawnee Mission, and how we can make sure that we're a voice to advocate for those as well.
We've never had, as far as I know, a specific federal platform.
NSBA provides one, and we're a member of NSBA. So NSBA does advocacy at the federal level. I went and advocated for the IDEA Act, I don't know, it's before COVID, 2 years ago, with our local KASB chapter has sent folks there to do that. So we kind of rely on their highlighting which issues are pressing for us at the federal level.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to.
Ms.
Sure.
Ashley,
Yes.
KASB also has a federal legislative policy that we as local boards have an opportunity to provide input on, and
Yes.
that link is available on the KASB website. Provide any input. We have our final meeting in January 20th and 21st. To make any other additional changes.
And did you have any follow-up questions for David or Stuart? I can't see you, so I don't know if I missed you. My apologies.
I would like to ask Dr. Little or to speak to the high-density at-risk. There was that school finance component. That was set the sunset last session, and the sunset wasn't removed, but it was extended through what a budget provided. So the change that was made last session, what implications does that have for us as a district? That is about $1 million or so towards our budget to meet the needs of those students and school settings. So does that have a differential impact the way it was changed from last session to what will be this session?
Thank you. The question is alive. Obviously, the bill, we introduced a bill that was heard and passed out of the Senate last legislative session, but it died when about 10 other education bills ended in March of last spring. So in lieu of getting the statute fixed, there was a budget proviso, meaning a guidance that was put in the appropriations bill that said that the high density at risk will continue for 2 more years. So it'll go through June 30 of 2022. So that's 2 years left in the cycle. We're assuming that it meets the guidance from the administration. We'll be requesting introduction of another bill to implement that full time in the statute, because as a budget proviso, it just has to go back and get renewed every 2 years. It's an accepted part of the school finance formula now after 4 years. We just need to make sure that it's put into statute.
So as a local district, can we budget against those funds? Can we count those funds in the budgeting process, so to speak?
It is authorized in the school finance formula through the school year 21-22.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any further questions? Okay, seeing none, thank you, Dr. Little, for joining us this evening. Thank you, David. If you would please communicate to our legislators, we appreciate their service right now, especially in light of everything that's going on. And we wish them the best of luck. Thank you. Okay, the next item on our agenda is an action item. We don't typically have action items during workshops, but this is due to the timing and a need to get this accomplished. I am seeking a motion to hire James Payne to aid the Board of Education in the superintendent search process at the contract rate of $100 an hour. Mr. Payne will provide a menu of options for us as we conduct the internal search, including conducting surveys and providing us the data from those surveys on attributes for a superintendent and concerns of the community. He'll also be able to help us with conducting the interview process and keeping it separate from our own internal HR process to allow for a more secure and impartial process. And so he would be beginning right away. If we approve this tonight, we would get him started. I'll be in touch with him tomorrow, and we'll work on the first step being the surveys and getting those conducted. So I will seek the motion for that.
So moved. Goodburn.
I move approval.
I'll second.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sinclair. Thank you, Ms. Goodburn. Dr. Sinclair for the motion and Ms. Goodburn for the second. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Hearing none, that passes unanimously. We're now moving on to our consent agenda items. I will seek a motion to approve the consent agenda.
So moved. Embry.
Thank you, Ms. Embry. Is there a second?
Second, Borgman.
Thank you, Ms. Borgman. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? All right, hearing none, that passes unanimously. And I think it might be a record. We are getting to board comments at 7:24. Congratulations to the board. I'll go ahead and start on my left with Ms. Embry. Would you like to begin with board comments this evening?
Yeah, I just wanted to remind everyone that the bond vote is out there. I'm sure everyone on the board plans to do the same. January 26th by noon is when they're to be returned. I also wanted to note, mid-December, the Governor's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice released a report. There was an entire section on school resource officers that I thought was really interesting. It's something I'd love to see our administrative team take a look at and maybe bring some thoughts back to the board about how we can take those recommendations and put them into action here in Shawnee Mission. Just personal preference, I would love to see that come before us. So that's it.
Thank you. Ms. Goodburn?
Nothing.
Thank you. I will just reiterate my comments that I made to Dr. Little in that there is quite a lot going on right now, and I express my appreciation and my concern for our elected officials both in Topeka and at the federal level and here at the local level as well. their service is appreciated. So I will end it with that. And I will move on to you, Dr. Sinclair.
I'd just like to reiterate my appreciation for the analysis on our student learning, the capacity to look at a more sophisticated analysis like regression, and is allowing us to better understand how learning is being received by all of our students and those with differential needs. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stratton.
My comments are at to follow up on Dr. Little's presentation, and I failed to do it while he was here, but I will do the same now. And that is that a thank you to he and David Smith and others who helped coordinate a conversation over Zoom with our legislators last week, so that all 7 of us board members and some staff were able to interact with, I would say, a dozen or so of our legislators from the area. I think that was a very important switcheroo to try to continue to have that conversation, but do it digitally. But as Dr. Little was also talking about the struggles that the Capitol's having to convene meetings electronically and be able to broadcast them, I wanted to make sure and say a big thank you to our IT and tech group and broadcast team. They're doing a spectacular job. Just an example of that meeting last time, that meeting that we had with those legislators included a broadcast and archive on YouTube. So not only was it available for folks to watch, it's put on YouTube. All these meetings are doing the same. That just doesn't happen. You're doing an incredible job. So I want to make sure that all of this, that the tech team gets recognized. Thank you.
Reverend Guy?
I want, first of all, to let people know with the bond vote, we checked right before our meeting started that there are ballot boxes where you can physically take it. I know for myself, we just received a Christmas package the other day because USPS is still snowed under from all the Christmas. So if you are concerned about your ballot maybe possibly not being received in time, there are ballot boxes, I believe, at the Central Library.
The Central Library, the Shawnee Library, and Jessica, do you recall the other two?
Delta
Mission.
County Election Office and then the
Down
Mission.
in Mission and Lamar.
Okay.
So if you want to physically deliver your ballot, you don't need a stamp. So I just want to make sure people are aware that there's that option. And I want to say a thank you again to our educators in particular. I know after the events in our country last Wednesday, a lot of teachers, especially history, government, social studies teachers, threw their lesson plans out the window and had to figure out on the fly how to help their students process what was happening almost in real time. And that's a rare talent, and I know we have lots of educators who are doing that, and I want to thank them for helping students process what's happening and learn from that experience. So thank you again to all of those teachers who had to do some real-time lesson planning on the fly last week.
Ms. Borgman.
I have a question and a comment.
Yes.
Dr. Fulton, have we heard anything about the calendar adjustment and our waiver, if that's been accepted?
We are going to have an update for you at the next meeting.
Okay.
We are looking at, we hope to make some calendar adjustments, but to be honest with you, we need to talk with the county about what they're going to do with vaccinations.
Okay.
Because that could have an impact on what we're able to do. But when we bring that forward to you, we'll look at what the final length of the school year would be, because we've got some nice provisions in there that we can make some adjustments. And also, we'll talk about graduation, that kind of thing. So we hope to have all the details. Well, we will have all the details for you at the next meeting.
Okay, perfect. And then
and you'll need to vote on that too, so we'll make sure that that's out in the public domain so everybody can see it.
Great. I'm glad that that's going to be addressed sooner rather than later, because I know we've gotten several emails and I've gotten a lot of texts on it. So couple shout outs to Miss Sneed and Miss Specht, who both won some pretty amazing education awards and music awards. Side note, my son has Miss Specht, and she is every bit as amazing as her award states that she is. So very, very happy for her. I spent a lot of time over the weekend speaking with teachers about the superintendent search, about the bond coming up, and I just want to thank all of them for their time and their thoughts I also have a listening session coming up here on Thursday. It's very important, I know, for all of us that we hear from our constituents. And we will have a survey coming up. And so there's going to be multiple ways for our community to really make their voice heard with our superintendent search. So please make sure you engage with us because it's important to hear from you. So thanks.
Well, thank you, everyone. With that, the meeting is adjourned. We do not have executive session, so there is no further business. Have a good night.